They said family dinners were sacred. That night I learned silence could be sharper than knives. The mahogany table stretched endlessly polished so brightly I could see my reflection warped by its glossy surface. Silverware gleamed like small weapons arranged in perfect symmetry beside crystal glasses that caught the chandelier's light. On the walls, the ancestors stared down in their uniforms, a gallery of rigid shoulders and brass buttons, every painted eye fixed on us like a silent jury. The air smelled of roasted meat, sage, and authority, my father's kind of air, heavy and difficult to breathe. He sat at the head spine as straight as if the core still lived in his bones, hand resting lightly on the stem of a wine glass. His presence was command enough. Even before he spoke, I felt my own words shrinking, pressed back into my throat. To Daniel, he began lifting the glass, his voice steady and rehearsed. "The next Cole officer. He carries our name into the fight, strong and true." The room answered him instantly. Brigadier Miller chuckled approvingly, clinking his glass with father's. My mother lowered her gaze as though modesty were her duty and nodded along. Daniel, broad-shouldered even in his cadet uniform, smiled with the kind of confidence that only grows when watered daily with praise. The toast carried through the air like a verdict already decided. I sat halfway down the table, 16 years old, in my navy prep blazer, its buttons pressing tight against my chest. I cleared my throat, feeling every ancestor's eyes upon me. "I've been working on my Naval Academy application," I said, my voice steadier than my heartbeat. "They're encouraging me to push for the aviation track." The sound of cutlery pausing was brief, but it was enough. My father's mouth twisted, not quite a smile, not quite disdain, just dismissal sharpened into habit. "Books and papers aren't combat," he said, as though that ended the matter. Brigadier Miller laughed outright, a booming laugh that filled the spaces between us. He raised his glass toward Daniel. "Not me." "That's right, Thomas. The boys who fight, they carry the name forward." I felt my cheeks flush, though no one looked at me long enough to notice. My mother pressed her napkin to her lips, but her eyes stayed lowered, loyal to silence. The table felt larger, the gap between me and the head of it widening until I might as well have been eating alone. I tried to focus on the feel of the blazer around me. It was stiff, unfamiliar, the sleeves brushing against my wrists like borrowed armor. If I held the buttons tightly between my fingers, I could almost imagine I was protected. The laughter faded, replaced with the scrape of knives on porcelain. Conversation shifted back to Daniel, his marksmanship, his leadership in ROTC, the inevitable commission waiting for him. Every word placed another stone on my chest. Finally, my father turned his gaze back to me, slow and deliberate. "Our daughter will keep the ledgers neat while the men fly." The words cut deeper than any knife could. My fork froze in my hand. Across the table, Daniel winced ever so slightly but said nothing. No one said anything. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, echoing sharper than the cutlery that had just been set down. That night, I swore the sky would answer louder than him. They thought my future ended at the table. I hid my real future in a manila envelope. Rain stitched the window with fine silver thread. My Annapolis room smelled of paper and detergent beneath a lamp. Blue angels stared from taped posters, jets mid-climb, white smoke cursive across blue. On the desk, forms like runway lights, a pen stamps a laptop purring. I read the instructions again, deadlines, signatures, block letters only. Boxes wanted certainty. My hands were ink-smudged and stubborn. They gave it anyway. Name, address, scores, service motivation. I wrote about the hush before a canopy seals, about checklists like prayer, about breath trimmed to fit margins. I deleted my father's laugh. Applications were no place for a man's echo. The rain tapped time. I stretched until vertebrae clicked. In the doorway, the soft scrape of a slipper. My mother, gray sweater mug in both hands. Steam softened her face. Light ringed her hair. She set tea beside the forms and stilled a rolling pencil. "Thanks," I said. I'm close. Her gaze traveled poster essay, the addressed but unsealed envelope lying like a closed mouth. Words rose, then settled. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I'll do this even if no one claps. I whispered, not sure if I meant the house or the world. Her mouth tried a smile and couldn't hold it. There's honey, she said, which meant be careful, and I see you. She adjusted the curtain and left quietly, the latch clicking like a small decision. I returned to the packet. Precision steadied me. Transcripts aligned. Recommendations squared. The essay breathed without drama. I wrote about discipline that isn't loud, how procedures leash fear, how accuracy makes room for courage. Midnight turned to 1. 1 slid toward 2. The tea cooled. The rain did not. When the body is very tired, it believes anything. For a few minutes, I believed perfect sentences could outrun a dinner sentence, that ink could be armor, that a poster could be a map. The belief held long enough to finish. At last, the packet stood in quiet order. I slid pages into the manila envelope and pressed the flap smooth. My address in block letters, theirs in smaller print. A stamp thumped home with finality. The envelope had weight now, paper turned to ballast. Footsteps in the hall, then stillness. I tucked the envelope beneath physics and calculus as if knowledge could bodyguard hope. The room exhaled. A car hissed past. I killed the lamp. The posters melted into dark like constellations behind cloud. Lightning laced the ceiling. The window rattled. Thunder arrived close, impatient, shaking something loose in my ribs. Someday I'll make the thunder mine, I said to the dark, and the promise hovered. Dawn came gray and damp. I pulled on a sweatshirt and fished the envelope from its hiding place. It felt cooler now. In the hall, my mother appeared again, sleeves, thumbed, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Going out, she asked, though the answer was in my hands. I nodded. We descended the narrow stairs. The third step squeaked. We both missed the trick of avoiding it. At the door, she reached for the knob, then ceded it to me. Outside the street was a wet mirror, leaves plastered. I heard the envelope rasp against my palm. The lawn shivered with leftover rain. A robin hopped along the curb, cocking its head like a tiny officer inspecting our quiet ritual now. We walked to the mailbox together, not touching. The red flag hung low, promise not called in. My breath ghosted. I lifted the lid. Metal kissed metal. A moment of nothing to count my heart twice. Letter slides into mailbox at dawn. The camera lingers on Evelyn's unreadable face. Sometimes betrayal doesn't need daggers. A single lie in a living room can cut deeper. By 2013, the living room had learned how to salute. A folded flag sat under glass on the mantel. Marine plaques marched along the wall. A saber hung above the piano like punctuation for a sentence only my father could end. Fire glowed behind tempered glass heat without mess. Guests filled the room with officer murmurs. Brandy sweetened the air. I was home on leave, civilian clothes failing to hide the academy's insistence in my shoulders. Mother moved with a tray of wine like a medic crossing a field, calculating where to step. Daniel stood by the hearth, handsome and modest in the way praise teaches you to be. Jack Miller sprawled into father's leather chair as if he'd earned the right to keep it warm. "How's your girl doing in the academy?" Jack asked, at last voice casual match to Tinder. Before I could inhale, father answered for me, warm with hospitality and finality. "She's not cut for field handles office support. Dan's the one who flies." It landed cleanly, a precision strike. No one gasped. Heads dipped, as at the end of a briefing. A small laugh popped and disappeared. Mother's wrist twitched. A crescent of red leapt the rim of a glass and spotted the carpet near her shoe. She set the tray down gently, as if not to disturb the truth that had just been installed. Conversation pivoted. PT scores weapons qual the future that already belonged to my brother. I could feel myself sliding off the page, erased by a sentence efficient enough to pass inspection. I stood beneath the saber and imagined it falling, cutting silence into ribbons. I. I began choosing steadiness over rage. I've been logging hours. Carrier approach in the sim. I'm on track to father tilted his chin the correction drill sergeants teach. Don't embarrass yourself. 3 words coordinates. They detonated between my sternum and the room. Jack didn't look at me. He looked at father the way men look at a map that confirms what they want to believe. Daniel's mouth opened and closed. Mother dabbed at the stain, choosing as always to tend carpet over casualty. The plaques translated my pulse into Morse. Office support echoed in the brass. What is denied at volume becomes policy when repeated softly enough. I swallowed and turned toward the piano. The framed photo above it held Daniel in uniform, jaw, set gaze squinting into a future the room had already assigned him. Beside it hung a matching frame left empty, years ago, a promise-turned placeholder. The matte inside had yellowed along the edges like paper left too long in a window. In the glass of the empty frame, I caught my reflection faint and double. "Can I get you another glass?" Mother murmured, voice so small it might have been the house. "I'm fine," I said, and was, if fine means operational under damage. Jack chuckled at something father said about leadership pipelines. Laughter flowed and receded. My skin felt tight. I remembered Annapolis rain sowing the night to the window. The envelope sliding into a blue mouth at dawn. The way a canopy seals the world out when you need sky more than sound. A lie survives because you carry it for the liar. I set mine down. So I didn't argue. Not there. The living room was a theater that preferred familiar lines, props, already placed, saber flag photo, empty frame. Evidence would only become another cue for the chorus. I let the scene close on its own terms and took my exit. The guests left eventually, their voices trailing down the walk like a retreating column. Father stacked compliments in the kitchen and went to bed satisfied. The house exhaled. I stood in the hallway mirror, with a narrow stripe of lamplight across my face. Everything else belonged to dark. Behind me, through the cracked door, the empty frame held a shard of light like a kept secret. My pulse slowed to something I could count. I looked in the mirror later. If he calls me a clerk, then I'll carve my name in the sky. I thought applause might heal me. Instead, silence filled every row. The Naval Academy auditorium smelled of varnish and chalk, a room engineered to turn young voices into doctrine. Banners hung with parade neatness, their braid catching a practiced light. Rows of mids filed in, chatter thinned to the hush of shoes. I waited behind the curtain dress, White's crisp notes steady until my eyes slipped to the front row where a placard waited. Reserved Cole family. One chair, straight-backed, untouched, a beacon of absence. When the curtain rose, the spotlight fixed me like a pin through a map. I breathed on, count the way instructors teach before carrier landings, and began deck sequencing approach patterns, the choreography of steel and wind. Slides bloomed arcs, vectors a ship's outline beaded with approach lights. Strategy prefers clarity over volume. I kept my voice level, my cadence clean. A cough cut the air. Quiet returned. My eyes drifted where my heart had gone first. The chair glowed with absence. That white card spoke my name, and the family name as if they were coordinates. No one arrived at them. I laid out contingency plans, redundancy, fail-safes. I pretended the ache in my throat was only dry air. The clock did its metronome work. I held formation. Applause came like drizzle, polite, thin, spent before it reached the stage. A few smiles, professional, the kind owed to competence rather than awe. I clutched my notes edges, biting my palm, and let my mouth hide near the paper. I'll earn claps that echo across oceans, I whispered to the margins. The promise slid into the linen of my glove and held there small and burning. The spotlight dimmed. Wood steps received my shoes one by one. Behind the wings, rope and canvas smelled of dust and old effort. My reflection found me in a steel cabinet, a pale oval cap, square eyes learning the color of refusal. I breathed until my ribs let go. Somewhere on stage, the next team adjusted a microphone, the room prepared to swallow another offering without chewing. Back in the house, the chair sat as faithfully empty as a kept appointment. I passed it, stopping long enough to set one fingertip on the placard as if touch might summon someone through time. It did not. An usher cleared his throat kindly, the way people do when they can't fix what isn't theirs. In the lobby, glass doors showed the Severn like hammered pewter. A breeze slipped under the frame, lifting a corner of my notes. I pinned them down. Classmates clustered by the bulletin board, comparing rubrics and weekends. Their voices skated over the floor like coins across marble. One offered a quiet, nice work, already half turned toward another obligation. I nodded, grateful for the thin ligature of civility that kept me from unraveling. I walked the hallway slowly, every plaque and class crest marking time. Silence accompanied me like a seasoned escort. It had weight now, not emptiness, but presence, the kind that trains you to stand straighter in its company. I thought of home, of a saber over a piano, of a frame left empty beside my brother's photo. I thought of air over wings and hands steady on a throttle, of the hour I would not need a chair to validate what the sky already knew. Near the exit, a younger mid lingered with his cover tucked under an arm, eyes soft with the awkward courage of someone who wants to speak and fears he shouldn't. He took one step closer, then another, and his voice kept to a whisper as if sound itself might bruise. Cadet whispers, "Your family didn't come." I swallow my answer. They mocked my uniform as a dead end. Rain made it shine sharper than metals. Dusk pressed purple onto the training tarmac runway lights, smearing into commas beneath the downpour. Rain needled my cover and spilled from its brim. Every breath tasted metallic, as if the air ran through a wrench. Cones marked the centerline, chalk arrows boxed the acceleration lane. The windsock thrashed. A whistle pealed twice, and the last cadets jogged toward light, laughing because they were finished. I wasn't finished. Water slid under my collar, but cold can be clarity. I paced the chalk, counting strides, boots kissing the paint scars left by years of tires. Stance, brakes, power, gauges, release. I rehearsed departure with an engine that existed only in muscle memory, arms setting angles my body trusted. Sleeves clung to my forearms, rain dark and gleaming. Dead end, they said. I looked like movement. Again. Knees bent, eyes up, checklist under breath. The storm swallowed my voice and gave it back as pulse. I drove forward until breath rasped, planted hard at the turn, pivoted, reset. The world narrowed to cones and speed, waiting just past the skin of air. Bootsteps found me irregular, human. I looked up. A figure crossed the tarmac with an umbrella shouldered into the wind. Civilian jacket. Familiar shoulders. Dan. He didn't call my name, didn't wave. He stopped a few yards off, centerline, rain drumming on the umbrella skin. He watched like a tower watches a runway. No interference, just attention. Sequence. Commit. Brakes, power, release. Accelerate, rotate, inside bone and will, if not yet, in the air. Water leapt from my shoes and immediately returned. The tarmac repainted itself slick. My hair plastered to my temple, funneling rivulets down my jaw. On the next pass, I lengthened the stride, let my arms remember what lift asks. The storm pressed a hand to my chest. I leaned until it yielded a fraction. He offered no commentary, and that restraint steadied me. Behind him, the hangar settled with an iron groan. Inside, red bulbs pulsed like a slow heartbeat. A gull skimmed low and vanished over the fence. I thought of the empty chair in the auditorium, how absence can glow louder than presence. Here, the math reversed effort into heat. Heat into proof. Again, the cold stitched my lungs with iced thread, but steadiness held. When I halted, hands on knees, Dan stepped closer, shoes sliding before they found grip. He studied my soaked uniform where rain lit the fabric until it shone as if polished, and something in his gaze shifted as though he recognized a metal no ceremony could pin. We stood without speaking. Tires hissed on the road beyond the chain link. The umbrella thrummed. The storm wrote its patient language on our shoulders. Persistence, pressure, patience. One day he'll have to watch. He said at last, a flare fired level into the future. I straightened, pushed wet hair back, nodded. The cold shook me. Resolve did not. His words settled behind my ribs like ballast, witness, not rescue, and enough. He tilted the umbrella upright. Rain leapt from its rim in a brief silver skirt, then fell through us both. He set it on the tarmac, open a small black tent collecting sky. Then he walked toward the gate without it letting the storm choose me if I wanted it. The umbrella rocked once, twice, then steadied. I stayed where I was. Water hammered collar cuffs the unguarded strip of skin at my throat. The uniform burned with wet shine. I reset my feet on the chalk, drew breath from the weather, and faced the center line again, feeling how decision can be warmer than any coat. I whispered to myself, rain now. Applause later. They said the past was sealed in oak cabinets. I found it waiting in a dusty box. The Naval Archives smelled of ink gone brittle and paper left to slumber. Overhead fluorescent bulbs hummed like tired insects, light falling in strips across rows of metal shelving. The air was cool enough to feel like a vault, a place where stories were pressed flat, cataloged and shelved until someone dared to remember. I signed the clipboard with a hand that didn't tremble, though my pulse drummed hard in my ears. Junior officer, 3 years into commission, yet it felt like I was breaking curfew again. The archivist clerk barely looked up from his crossword as he waved me toward the stacks. His pencil tapped, his glasses slid down his nose, his presence a reminder that to him, I was one more line in the endless ledger. That suited me. The less attention, the more I could breathe. I moved between cabinets marked training records, carrier operations, flight evaluations. The handles chilled my skin. The drawers rasped open with a sigh that stirred dust from years. Then came the box, oak-trimmed, unlabeled, resting at the bottom like something forgotten on purpose. I crouched, slid it forward, and felt weight press into my palms. Inside, folders thick with annotations, signatures, score sheets. I skimmed, fingers blackened at the edges until one line stopped me cold. Cole Madeline E. Carrier, qualification ranked top 3 class of 2016. The ink was not boast, but fact-stamped, initialed proof carved on paper. My throat tightened as if the years of dismissal had to claw their way out now. Page after page, my name repeated, flight hours, logged simulators, completed instructors' notes, concise, disciplined, precise under stress. I copied them at the machine, pages sliding warm into my hand, breath syncing with the rhythm of replication. Each sheet slipped into my leather satchel until the weight grew undeniable. I touched the satchel like armor, heavier than the blazer I once clutched at 16. Then my eyes caught another folder. Cole Daniel T. His records glowed with familiar steadiness, commendations, deployments, citations. Pride swelled, then dulled, twisting into something harder. His recognition had been spoken aloud, mine buried here. For a moment I wanted to shred the comparison, but my fingers smoothed the edge instead. I couldn't erase him. I wouldn't. This wasn't war between us, though our father tried to script it that way. Bootsteps sounded deeper in the hall. I froze, satchel clutched, ears straining. A shadow grew against the doorframe, then filled into a senior officer cap tucked under his arm. He studied me, then the open drawers, then the stack of fresh copies. His mouth pulled tight. "Careful, Lieutenant," he said, voice like gravel ground down. "Records have a way of vanishing. Paper doesn't always outlast politics." His gaze lingered, measuring whether I would wilt. I met his eyes without flinching. Then I'll make sure the sky itself keeps my receipts. The words steadied me, even as the silence swelled around us. He moved on, leaving the hum of lights and the echo of warning. I tightened the satchel strap across my shoulder, the documents warm against my ribs, and walked out of the archive, knowing I carried more than paper. I carried proof that silence had an expiration date. Sometimes the first counterattack is no louder than a whisper under steel beams. The Norfolk hangar kept its own weather jet A in the air, warm metal breathing heat, fluorescent bars blinking. Engines had cut an hour ago, but their language lingered, the ping of cooling cowlings, the hush after orders obeyed. I walked the center aisle, my leather satchel bumping my hip, flight logs inside like a second pulse. When the bay doors rolled half shut, the world narrowed to steel ribs and shadow. He waited by a Super Hornet's intake palm on the nacelle, as if feeling for a heartbeat. Jack Miller grinned the way men do when certainty feels won. Your father says you file paperwork faster than you fly. I let the joke lose altitude. Then watch me tomorrow at dawn. His brows rose. Dawn, huh? Better light for illusions. Better light for clarity. At the hangar, mouth night pressed against rain-streaked concrete. Farther off, Dan stood in a civilian jacket, hands in pockets, present not interfering. He gave me the smallest nod, a signal only blood decodes. I like a show, Jack said. And I like being right. He left with a laugh that thinned as it went. Before dawn, the base stood at parade rest, sodium lights haloing, puddles wine sliding under my collar. Pre-flight by checklist, not bravado, leading edges, caps, pins. The crew chief watched with blank patience, someone who has seen certainty come and go. Beyond the threshold, the Atlantic wore a pewter face. Jack arrived with a coffee at the fence line. Clearance breathed into my headset. Taxi, hold short. I let the checklist tame the moment, gauges, green trims set flaps where they belonged. A beat for the air to settle inside my lungs. Throttle forward. Acceleration braided with runway lights. The nose came alive. Rotation felt inevitable, just a sentence finishing itself. Wheels up, gear stowed the field, shrinking to gray geometry. I rolled through a practice turn, set the pattern, breathed on count. Final. Angle, sweet power whispered. The tires kissed the runway like good manners. No bounce, no drama, precision laid down like ink. Centerline held as if it were faith. Slow to dignified taxi. The crew chief's chin dipped. By the fence, Dan's shoulders lowered. Jack's coffee paused midway. Again, I said. Pattern approach, touchdown, repeatable, verifiable. On the third landing, a crosswind tested the flare. I tucked it clean, a correction, like signing my name without flourish. When I rolled clear, Jack had moved closer. His mouth formed a low whistle he caught and swallowed. Shutdown carried its own silence. I climbed down. The ladder rattled. The air smelled like hot dust and victory you don't brag about. Jack met me halfway to the chalk's, hands in pockets now, shoulders rounded by thought. She flies like a damn coal, he muttered, confessing to concrete more than to me. Dan heard. The words hit him and sank slow and deep. He didn't look at me. He watched Jack, and in that watching, the first hairline crack appeared in the wall our father had mortared for years. Not triumph. Pressure changed the second before weather breaks. I wiped grease from my wrist. The satchel tugged with paper gravity. Jack cleared his throat, already repairing his face. Good pattern work, he offered, safe as a ribbon for a child. His eyes kept drifting to the runway as if it might replay what he'd seen. We stood under the hangar's ribs while fluorescents hummed their lazy hymn. No applause. None required. Under steel, sound turns small, and truth has to share close air. I let the quiet settle until it felt like a verdict whispered, then turned toward light creeping under doors, carrying mourning like a sealed message. I to myself, if whispers make him doubt, thunder will break him. They trained me for combat in the air. Nobody warned me the boardroom was another battlefield. The Foundation's headquarters gleamed marble floors, paneled walls, flags in glass, portraits in oil. Outside, DC negotiated with itself. Inside, the air smelled of polish. A mahogany table ran the room like a runway, glossy enough to mirror a false horizon. At the head, Thomas lifted his chin medals, winking from his lapel as if they could file motions. Trustees settled pens aligned to note lines they had already chosen to believe. I stood at the far end with a portfolio lighter than any flight bag and heavier than the silence that followed my name. The proposal: expand simulator hours, modernize carrier qualification pipelines, create a fund that turns good cadets into great aviators. I spoke like I flew checklist cadence, clean turns through data. Slides lit with diagrams, numbers stacked in orderly formations. Dan sat mid-table, jaw tight. Jack lounged near the windows, his grin holstered but ready. Carrier landings to date, I said, sliding the verified log across the varnish. Top 3 qualification scores in my cohort. The pipeline works when you feed it. Context: Thomas cut in silk over steel. She's exaggerating. Numbers look large when you don't know which ones matter. Daniel's record is clearer and frankly more suitable for this board. A ripple of comfort traveled toward him. A trustee closed my packet as if to spare me weight. I kept breathing on count. The logs are signed by instructors and the deck officer, I said. What I'm asking for isn't grace. It's fuel. Emotional framing. His smile belonged to the dining room of my childhood. Leadership is presence, not spreadsheets. Dan has presence. Dan flinched, eyes sliding to mine in apology that couldn't speak. Pens resumed their mild tapping, a rainfall of doubt. Jack's low chuckle stuck under the table like gum. I widened the lens. The fund isn't for me. It's for the class behind me, the kid who will carry this patch when we've rotated out. Bigger sims, safer drills, fewer washouts, fewer incidents. Passion sells magazines, Thomas said. We prefer results. The chairman cleared his throat, a gavel in miniature. Questions flickered, then folded like gear retracting. The proposal is noted, perhaps tabled until a clearer vision emerges. Indefinitely polite burial. The word thudded harder than any arrested landing. I gathered my materials, pressure bleeding into my palms. The portraits watched with the patience they'd given others whose names drifted off plaques. Outside the windows, a sliver of Potomac flashed and vanished. I tried one more pass. You asked for results. You trained me to find them. This fund is where results grow. Thomas tilted his head, the old correction. Don't mistake persistence for gravitas, Lieutenant. Gravity bowed again slightly to the loudest voice. I closed the portfolio. Dan studied the tabletop as if a runway might appear and carry him out. Jack's smirk rearmed itself. Chairs pushed back, hands extended to congratulate the status quo. I walked the runway table from threshold to head and back, the grain gleaming under fluorescence, past the flags that blessed good intentions, past the portraits that never blinked. The door sighed when I opened it, tired of being the only honest thing here. In the corridor, the air cooled and unperfumed. My reflection followed in the glass dress blue's precise mouth, set to keep words from spilling where they'd be mopped up as tone. Marble gave way to carpet, then to the slow elevator that moved like a bureaucrat. When the doors slid shut, I let myself whisper a line meant for no one, and finally, for everyone. If they won't give me a stage, I'll build one in the sky. They silenced me in the boardroom, but the next strike would come where no laughter could hide. Don't miss what follows in next part. Subscribe now, so you'll be there when the ground beneath him begins to crack. They trained me to climb high. Just when I thought I'd taken the high ground, the ground itself gave way beneath me. The Veterans Hall in our Virginia town smelled of polish and fried catfish. Flags drooped from brass poles. Folded programs lined each table, embossed with the words, "Honoring Service." It was supposed to be recognition night. My name threaded into the agenda like a promise. I had pressed my blue's sharp buttons, gleaming heels tapping out the rhythm of expectation. I believed that even in Thomas's orbit, truth might find its own seat. Thomas arrived first, as always, stride measured, chin, lifted jacket heavy with ribbons like citations against dissent. Guests flocked to him, their laughter bending like grass under wind. Evelyn trailed behind him, pale and thin eyes darting as though the walls might offer escape. Dan followed last, his hand already tugging at his tie, his expression a struggle between bloodline and conscience. Reporters gathered near the dais, notepads, ready, cameras blinking red. I sat at the front, back straight, rehearsing how to accept a small plaque, how to thank the town that once cheered every Cole in uniform. The hall lights buzzed a false dawn. When the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, Thomas rose before his cue, sliding naturally into command. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth as a drill cadence. "The Cole name has stood for service. And tonight we honor Daniel, who continues that line with excellence. His ROTC record speaks volumes." Applause scattered like shot pellets. Dan's jaw clenched, eyes flicking toward me, but he didn't speak. My name waited on the printed program, and still it hadn't been uttered. A reporter asked the question I'd counted on. "Colonel Cole and your daughter. She's flown operations?" "Yes." The silence before his answer was a knife sliding from sheath. Then came the laugh, polished, dismissive, the sound I knew from 100 dining tables. "Maddie. She files commendations, keeps the ledgers tidy. We all need clerks, don't we?" The room erupted, polite laughter, easy, safe, my throat locked, words lodging like gravel. I had flown sorties at sea, trapped on wet decks, briefed men twice my age. And here, under these yellow lights, I was reduced to a secretary in their eyes. Evelyn's hand trembled against her program. She did not speak. I tried once, leaning forward, voice thin but clear. "That isn't true. My records." Thomas's eyes sliced across the room and into me. "Don't embarrass yourself, Maddie." The laughter doubled, now tinged with sympathy, as if I had overreached a child correcting her father in public. Jack Miller chuckled from the back, the old ally still loyal to the loudest voice. My chest burned hotter than any cockpit fire. By the time dessert arrived, my appetite was gone. Reporters scribbled, satisfied. I sat still, staring at the program that carried my name, but not my recognition. The applause had already passed to Dan, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, caught in the undertow. The next morning, the headline inked itself across my doorstep: "Cole daughter works desk, not cockpit." Words bold as verdicts, sharp as dismissal. My face felt erased, even as my name printed in black. I held the paper hand steady for once. In the kitchen sink, the clipping curled into ash smoke spiraling upward. The flame crackled louder than applause had ever been. I whispered into the gray air, steady, certain. Then let fire clear the air for thunder. The ashes dissolved into water, leaving only the hiss of extinguished lies. The Veterans Hall still stood, the town still believed him, but I knew the ledger wasn't closed. Because thunder doesn't whisper. It waits. They thought they buried proof under signatures and seals. I found the black box that still spoke. The storage hanger felt like a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. Dust hung in slanted light over crates and dormant parts. I walked the aisle with a flashlight and a folded list. Hector, on weekend duty, unlooped a chain from a mesh cage and tipped his chin toward a sagging shelf. "Maintenance manifests live back there," he said. "If anyone asks, you need torque specs." "Torque specs," I echoed. Dan slipped in by the side door, hood-up shoes leaving damp crescents. He checked exits on instinct. 15 minutes, he murmured. "Dad's at a luncheon." I hauled a box onto a bench and cracked the warped lid. Binders breathed old glue. Tabs, 2016-2017, training codes, tail numbers, deck logs in cramped lines. Then a note that "Stop me recorder swapped and sealed pending archive exercise Kilo 7 initialed, dated the week I learned to land when weather said don't." A second box weighted lower, heavier. I pried it up, fought a stubborn latch, and found an orange case faded toward brown corners, dinged seal intact. Hector whistled. "Ma'am, if that's what I think it is, it's evidence," I said, "and it belongs to the truth." Sunlight banded the floor. Dust lifted and settled like a slow, deliberate breath. We cleared space. Latches flipped with dull clicks. Foam cradled the recorder like a heart waiting. Ports. A battered label. My name wasn't on it. It didn't have to be. Hector dragged out an old reader and muttered about adapters. "If storage didn't rot, we'll get something." He connected leads with care. The screen woke. Static crawled. Then text. Playback ready. Noise first, wind shear engine, song a deck busy being a miracle. Voices thin with distance. LSO calls, checklist tones. Under them mine. Calm measured, a cadence built syllable by syllable in empty rooms. Coal on glide. Power correcting. Numbers marched, angle, airspeed descent clean. Touchdown spiked once. The trace settled like a pulse returning to rest. Dan leaned close. "It logs pilot ID linked to roster." Hector said, tapping. "Tail time code, manifest." Pilot Cole Madeline E. Relief hit hard enough to sway me. When a lie runs long, truth arrives like turbulence. I braced a palm on the bench. "Copy the segment. All of it." He started the transfer. Progress crept. A door complained along a track. Dan's phone buzzed. He ignored it. He kept watching the data as if our lives were printed there in green. "If Dad learns you have this, he'll destroy you." "He already tried," I said. "He'll try harder." I spread both hands on the case, feeling the seam where plastic met rubber, the seal meant to keep out water and fire, and the blame of men who prefer another story. Boardroom voices rose in memory, laughter in a hall that smelled like catfish and polish, headlines that cut deeper than knives. I pictured the satchel at home full of logs. The dawn I slid an envelope into a mailbox and the thunder that answered years later. Hector pushed a thumb drive across the bench wrapped in blue tape. "Mirror copy," he said. "Keep the chain clean." I took it, pocketing the proof. Dan finally looked straight at me, loyalty and truth sparring behind his eyes. "You sure you want this fight to get louder? If the truth is dangerous, then it's powerful enough." We refoamed the recorder, shut the case, snapped the latches. Hector rehung the chain and turned the key twice. My fingers smelled of rubber and history. Out on the taxiway, a breeze rose. I tested the handle once. The hangar quieted the way a stage goes silent when rehearsal ends and the performance is inevitable. Camera pans on black box in my hand, glowing red light blinking alive. They once dismissed me in hallways. Now they had to hear me in open court. The Naval Academy Review Board chamber smelled faintly of varnish and old ink. Dark wood panels carried echoes of a century of voices that had been weighed and recorded. Brass seals of authority glimmered against the walls, each one a reminder that decisions made here were meant to endure. I sat straight at the long oak table, uniform pressed so tightly that each seam cut into my shoulders like a second spine. In my satchel, heavier than it looked, lay the records and the copy of the black box file. For years I had been silenced in dining rooms and boardrooms. Today, silence would speak for me. At the opposite end, Thomas Cole leaned back, a shadow in metals and tailored confidence. His presence filled the chamber like it always filled our home command, without question, judgment, without appeal. To his right sat Brigadier Jack Miller, arms crossed, expression wary. He had laughed at me once in the living room. I wondered if he remembered. Dan stood behind, not at my side, not at Thomas's, but trapped in the neutral ground of silence. His eyes kept moving from my face to Thomas's, as though he were watching a duel he couldn't stop. The presiding officer cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Cole, you've requested this review. Present your case." I rose, opened the satchel, and spread out copies of flight logs. The paper smelled of dust and archives, but the ink carried my hours, my landings, my sweat. Carrier qualification scores. Exercise. Kilo 7, I said evenly. Top 3. My name logged in, roster verified by sealed manifests. This, I added. Holding up the drive is a copy of the black box recorder from that same exercise. The recorder cannot be forged. It carries digital signatures burned into hardware at the time of flight. The board leaned forward. For the first time, they were not only hearing Thomas's voice, they were hearing mine. Thomas's lips curved into a thin smile. My daughter is ambitious, he said, his tone smooth, polished. But ambition often breeds invention. Ask Miller. He was there. He knows the truth. All eyes turned to Jack. His jaw shifted. He had been trained for certainty, but his hands twitched once against his sleeve. Colonel Cole said she handled paperwork. He murmured almost too quietly. But he hesitated, looking at me, then back at the officers. She flies better than he says. It wasn't a declaration, not yet. But it was a crack. And cracks let in light. One officer noted something on his pad. Another leaned back, eyebrows raised. The presiding officer glanced between the evidence and Thomas. The board will require technical review of the recorder before reaching a decision. Until then, no verdict. The gavel struck once, a sound like a heartbeat muffled by oak. Thomas stood abruptly, chair legs screeching against the floor. He leaned close enough that only I could hear. His breath was sharp, his words colder. You don't belong in my name. My pulse steadied. My fingers brushed the edge of the satchel. For years I had carried silence like armor. Now it was a blade. I whispered back. Then I'll make the name stand for me alone. He stiffened, eyes narrowing before storming out with the clatter of metals. Jack followed slowly, shoulders heavier than when he entered. Dan lingered as if caught between tides before drifting after them. The chamber emptied until only the board remained, murmuring over evidence that refused to vanish. I gathered the papers one by one, slipping them back into the satchel. The black box copy stayed in my palm. Its small weight seemed immense, as though the future itself was stored inside. A future where my voice was no longer erased in living rooms, in auditoriums, or at polished tables. A future where shadows no longer hid the truth, but carried it, whispering through wood-paneled chambers until the world could not help but listen. For the first time, the silence was mine. They thought trials belonged in courtrooms. I carried mine into the open sky. Heat glazed the tarmac and bent the horizon. Beyond the barricades, thousands leaned on the fence caps, flags' phones lifted like a forest of glass leaves. Kerosene in summer made a nervous perfume. The announcer's baritone rolled across the field. I kept my breathing on count and my hands obedient to checklist. Sky above show center was an honest blue, the kind that tells the truth even when you're not ready to hear it. Straps, harness, comms. Canopy down. The world tightened to cockpit and breath. Taxi. Hold short. Clearance like a soft order. Throttle forward, spine aligned to the runway's white seam. Rotation wasn't heroism. It was inevitability. Wheels tucked. The city flattened to geometry. The river a strip of mercury monuments. Toy clean crowds, a shifting quilt. I flew the solo routine the way I had carved it in midnight rooms, a vertical pull that rang bone deep. A knife-edge pass that shaved the crowd's breath. A hesitation roll that made the horizon turn like a dial I alone controlled. Each figure wrote the sentence I had needed for years. I belong. I belong. I belong. Sun burned a bright vein along the canopy. A ghost of a dining room flickered, then dissolved in the slipstream. Recovery came on a thread of air so narrow it felt sewn. Gear down. Angle sweet. Flare. Tires kissed asphalt in a hush that sounded like relief learning its name. I let the jet roll proud, turned toward show center, and parked where cameras could drink every movement. When I popped the canopy, heat poured in with applause, whistles, the throb of generators, a child naming my aircraft like a friend. I climbed down the ladder, boots finding rungs by ritual. My satchel weighted by the chalks, brown leather darkened by purpose. The announcer boomed my name. The cheer rose and began to fall. I lifted the satchel high. The jumbotron brightened. Flight logs filled it, columns, signatures, the bureaucratic gospel my father had mocked. A close-up landed on Madeline top 3 qualification scores. Murmurs ran like wind in wheat. I passed a drive to the tech, briefed, but not told why. Cables drank the signal. The screen flickered again. Noise, first deck roar, LSO cadence, the metronome of checklists. Then my voice, calm and exact, on glide. Power correcting. Numbers marched in green angle speed descent. The approach trace drew itself across the screen like script on water. Touchdown spiked, then settled to level truth. Rumor had nowhere left to perch. The crowd did not cheer. It went quiet, the kind of silence that means minds are moving furniture. Near the VIP tent, my mother gripped the rail, knuckles white. Dan stood beside her, face open in a way I'd never seen in public. Past them, my father held the posture of a man convinced gravity still answers to him. The salute began where I least expected it. Jack Miller rose, cap in hand, shoulders squared to me as if finally aligned to a runway he trusted. Captain Cole, Air Force legend. His voice carried farther than engines. He held the salute. Others followed, pilots and parents, skeptics and strangers pulled upright by something older than habit. Applause returned like weather breaking, then rain after sirens. I didn't bow. I let the sound pass through me and out across the field until it thinned to wind. The screen replayed the landing once more, not as triumph, but as record. The air smelled suddenly cleaner, as if truth had pushed dust from the day. Reporters edged closer and stopped waiting to see where the moment would land. I looked to the VIP tent at last. Cameras tracked my gaze, hungry as hawks, and found the figure they came for. A breeze rolled across the bleachers, lifting paper programs and the faint smell of popcorn. Somewhere, a jet on standby exhaled a dry cough. I felt the weight of the satchel against my ribs, proof, made portable, promise made visible. I kept my hands still so no one would mistake steadiness for doubt. The sky held steady, bright above. Camera pans to Thomas, pale metals dull. They said he built his empire on silence. The silence now deafened him. The Virginia estate once smelled of cedar polish and cigars, the kind of air meant to remind guests they stood inside a legacy. By the autumn of 2022, that scent was gone. Curtains hung limp, the long dining table stripped of its parade of silver and crystal. Portraits of stern ancestors remained on the walls, but they stared down at emptier rooms as though confused about where the audience had gone. News had traveled quickly after the air show. First, the Naval Foundation Board announced that Thomas Cole's honorary titles were no longer consistent with the values of the institution. Within days, trustees who had once toasted him at banquets issued polite letters of resignation from his circle. Donors pulled their names from plaques. Speeches he had once been invited to give were quietly reassigned. Silence had become his new reception. Maddie walked the hallway one evening, her boots echoing against marble that used to drown in chatter. She no longer came in anger, only in witness. Her satchel of records rested on her shoulder like a quiet partner. She passed the great hall where years before Thomas had raised a glass to others while erasing her. Now the glasses were gone. The echo itself seemed to accuse him. Evelyn found him first. She entered the study without knocking. Thomas sat at his desk, medals laid out in uneven rows, the brass dulled under weak light. He turned one over, then another, as though trying to remember which campaigns had earned which gleam. Evelyn's voice was not loud, but it cut deeper than shouting. "You erased our daughter," she said. "Now you're erased." Thomas looked up, but there was no command left in his stare. Only the hollow shock of a man who once believed silence meant victory. Dan arrived later that night. He carried no umbrella, no careful diplomacy. He simply stood in the doorway, while his father nursed a drink. I always believed her. He admitted, voice trembling but steady enough to hold. I just wasn't brave enough to say it then. His words did not echo, they stayed heavy and undeniable. Maddie did not linger to watch her father unravel. She moved through the estate quietly, tracing each room as though closing chapters. In the ballroom she saw dust layering the chandeliers. In the library, books once used for grand impressions remained untouched. Every corner of the estate had become a mausoleum for pride, a shrine to a man who mistook control for legacy. By midnight, Thomas was alone in the great hall. A single lamp cast more shadow than light. He poured another glass but did not raise it in toast. There was no one left to answer. The medals before him reflected not glory, but isolation. He stared at them as though daring them to salute him one last time. None did. Outside, Maddie paused at the gates. She looked back once at the dark windows, then turned toward the road where her own path waited. Legacy is not what they give you, she whispered, voice steady against the night. It's what you survive. The house behind her kept its silence. This time the silence belonged to him. They left me with ashes. I built wings from them. The airfield crouched between marsh and meadow, a strip of asphalt in wind that smelled of hay and hot aluminum. Sunset laid a band across the runway. I set cones along a chalked center line and drew an acceleration box, the old geometry that once taught my lungs to keep time. A handful of cadets formed a crooked semicircle, wide-eyed sleeves, 2 new boots not yet squeaking. Checklist isn't punishment, I told them, pacing the box. It's how we make courage repeatable. We breathed on a 4 count. We practiced signals, learned how calm sounds over a dying headset and how to correct without drama. A freckled boy fumbled. I reset him with a nod. A quiet girl carved the box in 3 exact strides and smiled as if a door had opened she could see. Courage, like landing, is a sequence you teach your bones. Between runs, I drank from a dented canteen and let dusk cool the heat behind my eyes. The field settled into clicks of aluminum contracting and birds returning. My phone stayed in my pocket. There were calls I didn't owe anymore. Gravel popped. My mother walked up in a sweater too thin for the hour hands clasped. She stopped at the cones, chin lifted against a crosswind only she could feel. Silence was my sin, she said, setting each word down carefully. I thought if I stayed quiet, the storm would pass. I was wrong. It didn't break me. It unknotted what years had tightened. I know, I said. She reached for my elbow, then stopped. Can I stand here sometimes? Not to fix anything. To witness. Yes, I said. But boundaries. No more speaking for me. No translating me smaller to make rooms comfortable. I won't. I saw the girl she'd been before loyalty hardened into quiet. An engine I knew downshifted by the gate. Dan climbed out with a folder and the resolve he wore to difficult meetings. He scanned the field, then crossed the gravel like a man approaching a threshold he meant to honor. The trust documents, he said, lifting the folder. Scholarship sim hours travel for carrier quals. You chair the board. I'll fundraise and take the heat. You do have presence, I said, and the joke earned the small laugh it asked for. Partners. Partners, he echoed. He shook hands with the freckled boy, praised the quiet girl, nodded to our mother. We ran the final reps in light that made even mistakes worth keeping. I let them call cadence. Then I set them shoulder to shoulder and faced them toward the runway, the same direction I had faced alone in weather and crowds. At attention, I said. They moved as one. Hands rose in salute. The sun threaded between fingers like ribbons. The gesture rippled through rooms where applause had never come. I held it and stayed still. When I dismissed them, they didn't scatter. They lingered with questions about angle of attack, about fear, about loneliness that hides in a cockpit, and how to train it to ride in the back seat. I answered plainly. Landing is a set of doors. Open them in order and the ground arrives kindly. Evelyn stood a little apart, learning how to be quiet without vanishing. Dan reviewed line items with a cadet who might one day sign checks that keep another kid from washing out in a storm. I stowed cones, wiped chalk from my palms, and let dusk widen without asking me to perform. The field hushed to crickets and an occasional tick of cooling metal. A thin ribbon of twilight held the horizon together. I locked the hangar, slid the last cone inside, and took one look down the runway that had carried every version of me. The scars were still mine. So was the sky they taught me to trust. This time, silence is not erasure, it's respect. They once erased me with silence, now silence was the headline. The courthouse steps kept winter under a thin sun. December light laid a blade across the columns. Breath from the press rose like steam. Ropes bowed, microphones butted, lenses winked. Inside, the judge's cadence closed its ledger, fraud dishonor sentence entered. The gavel sounded like a door locking from the inside. Inside, the judge spoke without theatrics, each count falling with the weight of winter brick. Outside, the air met that weight and held it as if city itself exhaled at last. We came out into flashes. Dan paced my right like a wingman. Evelyn kept to my left, gloved hands folded. The marble caught our footfalls and returned them as if it needed proof we were real. Above, the flag cracked once, then held. Captain Cole, any comment someone called fishing for a soundbite. Others spilled questions. What does justice feel like? Did you expect today? Voices clattering like coins. Marshals steadied the ropes with open palms. I didn't raise a hand. I raised a medal. Steel and ribbon. 1,000 flights, 1,000 returns. Sunlight found the medal and stood there. The crowd's noise drained and left a ring of quiet, not the old quiet that erased, but a chosen quiet with edges. Phones dipped. A printer in a van chattered. A headline bloomed on a screen as if it had waited for light. Captain Cole speaks without a word. A young officer lengthened his spine and remembered how to stand. Jack Miller had been in the second row. Now he stood at the edge of the crowd, out of uniform, cap in his hand. He faced the steps and lifted a salute shaped by humility rather than rank. The marshals didn't stop him. The gesture set and others straightened on instinct. Evelyn's fingers brushed my sleeve, permission asked, not taken. Dan's shoulder hovered, then gave me the width of a breath to be exactly my size. Behind us, the doors opened and closed. Inside, clerks began their permanent work stamping a name that had once been weapon and now was record. Captain, please, just one line, a reporter tried again, softer now. I let the medal rest in my palm and felt its chill ease. Snow hid along the balustrade and glittered like the last defense of a season on its way out. I thought of a long table where applause was rationed, an auditorium chair reserved for ghosts, rain polishing a uniform, a hangar where whispers did more damage than shouts, a flight line where rumor learned math and lost. I thought of cadets saluting the runway because I'd asked them to trust what quiet can mean. Jack lowered his hand. Dan exhaled. Evelyn closed her eyes and opened them again. A breeze lifted strands of my hair and made the metal tap my knuckles once, like a friend telling me to keep pace. It wasn't conquest. It was alignment, fact, with record, with witness. I tucked the metal against my heart, and the city trained to chase noise stood still. The headline would travel to kitchen tables and late-night sets. I didn't give them a quote. I gave them a measure. We took the steps slowly. Somewhere, a bell counted the hour and didn't rush. On the sidewalk, a child on his father's shoulders raised 2 fingers like a salute. The father learning followed. Silence isn't absence. It's the proof I won. I carried wounds no uniform could cover, but I never let them define me. If my story reaches you, I ask for your voice. Lend me the support that was once denied. Tell me if you see strength where others saw only silence. Remind me that dignity can be louder than cruelty. And for yourself, take this truth: when life tries to erase you, build a record no one can burn. Stand tall even if no one claps. One day, the silence around you won't mean absence, it will mean respect. And that respect, once earned, will last forever.